Hey girl, hey.
Hey girl, hey, how are you today? What are you up to?
Ariel, I'm a little tired, but I'm so happy to be here in conversation with you. So that's given me life. So happy to be working alongside of you and super happy that we are now in the same city.
Yes, in the
Yes,
same city, working in the same space. So
that's right.
yeah, I'm transitioning from being a classroom teacher to working at the Teachers College Reading and Writing Project as a staff developer. So
I
super excited
know.
to be your colleague.
I'm so excited. So,
So
Ariel, as we think about, the year ahead for us with educators, and we think about the year ahead for all educators, I know that you and I had several conversations about this and thought about some of the essential questions and thinking that we believe educators should be considering right now. Um, and I know one of those things where you and I both strongly believe is where all educators should start, which is thinking about the ongoing internal and interrogation of self that will allow us to show up differently. And by differently, I'm thinking of the piece that Dr. Bettina Love wrote in 2020, right after the pandemic hit, this piece about how we can't go back to what has become normal in education. It had become normal for, so many of our students, in particular Black and Brown students, to have the kinds of experiences that just, are so drastically different from their white peers. And so when we say, the internal work and the interrogation of self that will allow educators to show up differently, I'm wondering if maybe we can name out some of those actionable steps that I know you're recommending to educators and I'm recommending to educators. Um, where do we begin with that work?
well, I think we always begin with the self, right?
Mhm.
I think we have to interrogate ourselves in order to do any effective work. Because if you haven't done the work yourself, then you certainly can't do it with children and in community with other adults. You can't dismantle
Mhm.
systems that you don't understand and you haven't interrogated, and that begins with the self. I think it's really important for us to know who we are and how who we are impacts how we show up as educators, and how our identities intersect with those of the educators and children with whom we're working in a school. I think it takes a lot of humility,
Mhm.
and I think that that is critical for us right now, as we re-enter possibly school buildings or continue online. I think humility has been a huge part of pandemic teaching. Like I've been teaching for 22 years when the pandemic started, and all of a sudden I had no idea what I was doing. Right. And so I think that that is going to be critical, is that we continue to have that humility that forces us to think about what we're doing, how we're doing it, and how those things are impacting children. And the other thing about identity that I think about in its intersection is children are coming to school full of questions, full of ideas, full of inferences that they've made over the past year and a half or so. And so I think, last year at the beginning of the school year, we have to be prepared for how kids show up. And last year at the beginning of the school year, my kids showed up with questions. And the first question we faced was, Miss J, what's going on with 2020? Like they wanted to know. And it was like first Kobe Bryant died, and then the pandemic happened, and now I'm stuck in my house and I can't go to school and I can't see my friends. And there are fires, I was in California, there are fires going on. And these 8-year-old children were just like, why is the world so hard right now? Why is it so difficult? And so we have to, if we haven't interrogated these things and ourselves, like, and they were asking, what about this Black Lives Matter thing, Miss J? Like kids have questions and they want to have conversations that'll lead them toward answers. I don't know that um, there are some answers, there are some truths, but then there are also some places where we have to sit, with that idea that we're not going to completely find the answer, or solve the problem within this conversation. So yeah, what are you thinking about with regard to interrogating the self and how teachers come back to and show up in
Yeah.
classrooms?
Yeah, I was thinking a lot about what you said about how it requires, humility. And I think too often teachers become mired in this thinking that I must be expert at all, right? As part of my teacher identity, I must be all knowing. And so I agree with you so much, Ariel, that part of the internal work begins with being humble and recognizing that there's so much that we don't know, and we don't know what we don't know. And we have to be willing to face that there's some unlearning that needs to happen in order for us to show up differently. And so I think that takes courage, right? Courage to humble oneself, to admit and to acknowledge that things were not really working before the pandemic, not for all children. And so it takes courage to really acknowledge that. It takes courage to think about what has been my role in that in order for me to show up differently. And I'm also thinking about, along with courage, the importance of community, right? So I hear you saying begin the year with allowing kids to talk about what has happened and the questions that are on their minds that they've been living with, that they are wondering about, that they want to engage in dialogue about, right? So when we think about building community, some of the ways teachers do that might be, what's your favorite food and what are your favorite color? And then we just sort of like, look what you have in common with this person. But building community, right, is also like, let's talk about, this is a space where you can talk about what has happened. And right from the start, letting children know that who they are, all of them, the fullness of who they are welcome in this space. And that includes the kinds of questions that are very much connected to identities and specifically race, right? As we have been dealing with this virus, two viruses, right? The COVID-19 virus and racism, a pandemic within a pandemic. And kids are noticing this, and they're going to want to talk about this. Will this be a space where they can do that work safely? What will be the conditions you nurture in your classroom that will allow kids to do that work? Again, teachers, we want teachers to see this as parallel work to the ongoing interrogation of their own biases that they need to do. And so along with courage and community, I would say commitment is important, right? That this is to see this as continuous work, not just work that you're doing at the beginning of the year, but work that threads all across the year so that everybody can thrive. And folks can't thrive if they're walking in the door not feeling whole. So when I'm thinking about that ongoing work, those are some things that come to mind for me. And I think that also relates to, one of our other questions, Ariel, which is there's this dominant narrative right now that I think will very much jeopardize all the things we're talking about with internal work and interrogation of self. And that dominant narrative is about the learning loss, right? The learning loss of students. And so one of the questions we want educators to be thinking about is, how will they resist? How will they avoid learning loss narratives, and to focus instead on cultivating humane learning environments where all students can thrive? So what are you thinking about what to do around that learning loss narrative area that we know is so dominant, that teachers are going to be hit with from administrators? What do we do to navigate that?
Well, I think first and foremost, and this kind of made me think about it when you were speaking to the last question, but I think one of the things when we're interrogating ourselves, we have to think about is what we believe about children.
Yeah.
And, some people believe different things about different children. And so
Mm,
we have to interrogate ourselves and think about that. But
mhm,
I respect children and I believe that they are intellectuals. I believe that in some regard they are my equal and they are my teachers within the democratic classroom that I try to create. And so I think that that's where all of this starts. Like this idea, this narrative of a learning loss is shows a total disrespect for children. If
yeah.
you don't, if you if you don't believe in children and you don't believe that they're intellectuals, if you believe that you are the font of knowledge and you are pouring into them, then that allows you to believe that it's learning loss. But children, that's not who children are. Children
Mhm,
learn first and
yeah.
foremost wherever they are.
Yeah. I love that you said to begin with, what do we believe about children, right? And I want to add, and what do we believe about the purpose of education?
Absolutely.
Right. So when we start to hear that learning loss narrative as we go back to school in whatever capacity we're going back to school, um, what I hope educators will think about is, you know, the things we discovered during this pandemic, is that the United States educational system has always been plagued by racial and socioeconomic inequities, right? And we saw the pandemic exacerbate these inequities. We saw, though, a response to that we hadn't seen before the pandemic. We saw, suddenly let's get all the kids laptops. We saw, affirmations of caregivers and teachers, and an acknowledgement of their importance. We saw an encouragement of teachers to be creative, to develop curriculum that really centers on kids and their needs. Essentially, what we were observing, for me for the first time, was addressing problems resulting from systemic racism with anti-racist solutions. So what do we believe about children? What do we believe about the purpose of education? And if we believe that all children deserve access to education, and that the purpose of education is for liberation, then when those learning loss narratives start to rise, we will hopefully, as educators, push back on them by talking about the disparities in education between Black and Brown students and white students that have always existed, um, and how the ways to close any kinds of gaps. And I do believe in Dr. Ladson-Billings and Ibram Kendi and Zaretta Hammond, who do not call this an achievement gap, but an opportunity gap, that we close this gap with anti-racist solutions. And that begins by thinking about our kids, the purpose of education, and then starting to address those disparities in humane ways that we saw glimmers of during the pandemic.
Yeah, makes me think about Dr. Ladson Billings and the educational debt, right? I think what I'm
Mhm.
hearing you say, Sonia, is that in some places, not all, but in some places, that debt started to be paid. You
Yeah.
know, to a certain extent. I was in a school district where all children were given devices. I was in, and all children were given access to the internet and those sorts of things. And so, yes, starting to pay that educational debt, she has that broken down into multiple categories. And so I think, and I love the way that you reference the idea that education is for liberation. I too believe that that's what it's for. And it's something that I've been passionate about and working on and thinking through for several years with alongside children.
Mhm.
And I've kind of developed this whole construct of the pillars of freedom. And I think through that lens when I'm working with teachers and kids. And one of the things that's there as a pillar, which I must say I owe everything to the children that I've been working with for this to be a pillar and be present there, is this idea of having a radical imagination. And
Yeah.
so that's not just for children. And as one of my kids said, imagination is not just for playing.
Mm-mm.
Imagination is one of the ways in how we get to freedom. That's what a child said. Imagination
Mhm.
is how we get to freedom. And so what are we doing as adults to radically reimagine what
Yes.
school can be and should be for children? And I think,
Mm.
part of that for me is advocacy. I think we have to, as an education community, we have to get it together. I think there are brilliant, beautiful scholars and educators who are advocating in a silo almost for
Mhm.
these changes. And we need to be about the business of systemic anti-racism, meaning that we need to create a system where we're all advocating alongside one another. Because
Mhm.
I guarantee you, the side that's on the other side of what I'm talking about, they're
Mhm.
very organized. They have a system in
Yeah.
place, and we have to have a system that counters that. So,
Yeah.
um, yeah.
Yeah, I think the radical imagination point is so important for educators to be thinking about, because what we see with this learning loss narrative is not a radical imagination, but a racialized imagination, right? This framing of children having fallen behind is really based on a set of racialized assumptions that are centered around test scores. And this is another example of the nation's historical amnesia, to just simply forget all of the research around racism that is entrenched in, any of the standardized tests or the kinds of tools that are going to be coming out of this learning loss narratives. That the point of this has always been to perpetuate this myth of inferiority within Black and Brown students. So I want educators to really think about what you said about the debt that is owed to students who have been marginalized, to pay attention to the historical, economic, and sociopolitical moral debts that that are have led to this gap, right? When we think about students who have just consistently been denied access to education. And so for teachers who are navigating the learning loss issues that may come up in their schools, where they have administrators who are saying, you need to do this work because of that, um, perhaps one way to mitigate that work, that narrative, is to remember to look at your children and to see them as not students who are deficient, who are missing what's needed to have lifelong success, but instead to think about the back pay, as Ladson Billings says, that they are owed as a result of enduring these inequities for decades and decades.
I also want, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, go.
I also want teachers to look at children through the lens of abundance,
Yeah.
right? both abundance in who these children are and
Mhm.
what children every single child I've ever encountered is carrying abundance of something. And so looking at them through this lens, not of deficiency, but of abundance, and where is that abundance and what is that abundance? And also looking at the resources through a lens of abundance, right? So the answer to this alleged learning loss is let's get kids reading right
Yeah.
away. Your classroom library, your school library, their homes, the library, the neighborhood library, they need to be full of books that kids want to read, right? And that
Mhm.
they are going to enjoy. We need resources, not a computer for a child. There's no way to look at a child sitting at a computer doing a computerized program for remediation. There's no way to look at that through a lens of abundance. There's nothing abundant about that, right? And so if we use a lens of abundance, then I think we are also going to make better choices about what we're doing alongside children. And we definitely don't want to be doing things to children. That's something um, that's problematic. So one of our other questions that we have, but I think like we're leading into now, is like how will
Mhm.
you learn about and honor your students' pandemic learning gains from the time that they spent in their homes, in their communities, in schools? Like, how do we access that from the very beginning of the school year and help children to see their own abundance by giving them opportunities to share those things with us?
Yeah. Well, I love the answer of abundance to that question. I really, really do. And it makes me think it makes me think about Dr. Ernest Morrell, who, again, it was last year, he was in conversation with Mel Duke and also addressing, the sort of learning loss narrative that had started to emerge, right from the start. That, we need educators not to assume that our kids have not been learning, right? But and he said that they've been bathed in love. They've been bathed in love and learning in their homes and in their communities. And so our challenge as educators is to tap into that, right? To understand the ways that our kids have been learning, to listen, to explore alongside of our students, and then to gather that abundance and use that to drive our instruction. So I couldn't help but think about that when you were talking about that word. And I also think an important lens in terms of honoring students' gains from the time spent in their homes and communities is affirmation, right? So abundance, but also affirmation, right? In what ways will we as educators affirm, which means to recognize and to value and to validate um, our students and their lives and their experiences and their knowledges? How are we doing that? What's our plan for doing that rather than barreling forward with our first uh, unit in our content areas, right? How do
Right.
we instead invest that time in learning about our students and affirming? And then I think another important lens that I talk about with educators is awareness. So in what ways is it our plan to help students develop an understanding around inequities so that they understand always and right from the start that it isn't them. They are not the problem. The problem has everything to do with inequitable systems and structures and practices and policies. So what's our plan to help students understand that, to develop an awareness around how inequities work so that they can also start to develop and hone tools to disrupt this in their lives?
Absolutely. Another thing that I've been thinking about a lot is what kids learned about social emotional well being.
Mm,
during the pandemic. And I think that whether they learn something about their families or communities themselves, I think those are all lessons that they need to carry with them back into the classroom and forever and always, right? As human beings, I think, my students, I can speak for my experience with them. I think they're well positioned to be with, guidance and support to be some of the healthiest, human beings that have graced this orb in a really long time because of the time that we spent like really thinking about our feelings and how our experiences were impacting us and the value and importance of community when
yeah,
enduring something like the trauma of something like a pandemic, right? And so I think it would be ill advised of a teacher to welcome kids into the classroom and then just say, okay, today we're going to start on page one of the math book or the basal reader or whatever it is, and not affirm, acknowledge, help kids to understand that, yes, I understand that you're feeling some kind of way, right? We're all feeling some kind of way, and how do we work our way through this? And I personally believe that literature can be a huge part of that.
mm,
Poetry is something that I have leaned into as a teacher, as both a literacy tool, but it's also a social emotional well-being tool, both the reading of poetry and having children write poetry. I had my students wrote some really beautiful poetry about their experiences during the pandemic. And so with that being said, like if I'm encouraging teachers to lean into that, I again want to go back to you have to be ready for that,
yeah,
right? Because that's going to bring up all sorts of things for kids. And so, you have a guidance counselor, I hope some places do, a guidance counselor on site or within your school district. And I think, guidance counselors need to be having conversations with teachers about, okay, what are we going to do? What is it going to look like to stand beside children and help them to heal from the trauma that could have, I'm not suggesting that everyone experienced trauma, but this trauma that could have been a part of your experience during the pandemic.
yeah,
And, I really also, in terms of just honoring children, I think it's so, like, I think that that's the first inquiry for everybody of this school year, right? Like,
mhm,
the way to honor their learning gains is to make space for them in our
yes,
classrooms and provide opportunities for them to share those things with others. I think if we
mhm,
ignore that in any way, whether it's social, emotional, or academic, then we're doing a very, very much doing a disservice to
yeah,
the children
yeah.
that we teach.
Yeah, and I think, interconnected with that question of how do we honor our students is one of our other questions, Ariel, which is, that we want educators to think about, which is, how will your curriculum emphasize the importance of working to truly know students, their personal and social identities, as well as the communities that educators serve. And so part of what you were talking about, Ariel, made me think about what are the ways that we get to really know our students? What is the inquiry that we will pick up, that we will take up to do that in order to recognize the abundance, right? I love the interconnectedness of all of our questions, the abundance of the powerful ways of knowing and learning that will present itself in our communities, in our learning communities with our students. And those are grounded in cultural and community and collective practices. Um, so we need educators to be willing to understand who are the communities that they serve, what do we truly know about them, how do we get to know communities deeply. It certainly won't be by driving in to a community and then just driving out at 3 p.m. You know, what are we, how are we going to learn about our communities and then use that to ground our classroom practices um, in our students' lives? And, you know, that requires educators to get comfortable being uncomfortable, and a willingness to talk more than just about favorite colors and books and hobbies, right? Those personal identities, but to also understand students' social identities, their racial identities, their gender identity, their religious identities, and more, right? And we know that our good friend Sarah Ahmed, or one of the tools that should be in everybody's toolkit, is those identity maps, which can be a way for students to start to think and share about their identities when they feel safe to do so. To see these identity maps not as artwork to plaster on the walls, but as work that is ongoing and fluid, as a way of building community. Do you have other tips, Ariel, that you've used in your classroom?
Well, you know, I
For how
actually,
to, yeah.
I had written down Sarah. I also think that, like, first day, like, what's in your news today? I think you just
Yeah,
need to buy Being the Change, first of all, just
yeah,
buy the whole book. But,
yeah.
what is in your news today? How's that intersecting with your identity? I think you get real close to where kids are really soon when you start to ask them those kinds of questions and
Mhm.
get out of the surface things, right? We don't want to stay on the surface. We want to kind of dig deep. And then, in terms of when you were talking about the community, I lived about 2 miles from my school, and there were days I would just walk to work.
Mhm.
Let me tell you, just seeing me walk to work with my little backpack on through the neighborhood was a tremendous it had a tremendous impact on both
Yeah.
parents and kids, because they're like, "What are you doing here?" Like
Mhm.
walking through the neighborhood. I'm like, "Well, I only live," it feels like another world, but I only live 2 miles, away from the school.
Yeah.
And it sends a lot of messages, right? I feel safe
Yep.
walking. What Meanwhile, I have colleagues telling me to stop because I'm not safe, of course, right? But I feel safe
Mhm.
walking through this neighborhood. I value you enough to like stop and talk to you at the fence, if
Yeah.
you're outside and that sort of thing. And also
Yes.
just taking the time, like, we're teachers. We know we work late. Sometimes I just take a break and like eat at a restaurant in the neighborhood. Like, just go around the corner to the
Yes.
taqueria and eat there instead of running somewhere out of the neighborhood to grab
Yes.
food and bring it back because I knew, I had to eat something. I was going to be there for a while. And
And
that made
Ariel,
it.
that is so huge and so important. I want to just amplify what you're saying, because kids know how outsiders talk about them and their neighborhoods. They know it. And even our youngest kids know it. So, although I've been out of the classroom, I do go into different classrooms. And I remember going into a classroom in the Bronx here in New York. It was a second grade classroom, Ariel, and we were talking about what's beautiful in our community, in our neighborhoods. And this little Black girl said there's nothing beautiful
Oh,
in this neighborhood, nothing. And I said to her, I parked about 4 blocks away, and as I walked, I saw this playground and everything was painted red and green and black, and it reminded me of flags in Africa and African countries. And then I happened to notice these murals, right? There are these large streets there where if you go up a huge flight of staircase or down the staircase, it connects you to another street, and in between that causeway, I don't know what the word is that you call it, that connector, there are these beautiful murals that like seem to capture the history of the community. it's so colorful and bright. And a boy in the classroom started to talk about when it snows, how he sleds down that large staircase. I said, that's beautiful. But like I had to like imagine if I hadn't done that walk,
Right.
that 4 block walk before I entered that school to come in the classroom and to do some work with them in reading workshop, I wouldn't have that knowledge. How
Right.
many teachers park their cars and walk looking to capture the beauty of children's communities so that they can reflect that in the classroom to help counter the messages that kids absolutely are aware of about who they are and who their communities are.
Absolutely. You know what you just made me think of, Sonia, is like I'm always thinking through this teacher lens, like what's next? Like if I'm the teacher in that classroom and I hear that child say that, first thing I think of is Last Stop on Market Street. That's the
We were
very
reading
first
Last
thing.
Stop on Market Street.
So
We
the
were
very
reading it.
first thing I think of is like, we need to read this. Then we're going on a walk through the neighborhood. And then we're going to do a shared writing piece that is our very own Last Stop on Market Street in our
Yes.
class. And, you know, that I think about that book so much.
Mhm.
You know, I lived
It's
in
the
the
book we were
Pittsburgh area.
reading. It's the book we were
That's
reading.
amazing.
And she was just like, yeah, there's nothing beautiful about my neighborhood. And I wanted to I wanted to take the whole class outside. Like,
Right.
no, look at all this beauty.
And, you know, I had a little girl that came out when the class that I lived with when they were in kindergarten. And it was actually the book that we read on the last day of school before
Mm,
they went home. And this little girl, she said, I said, I wonder, you know, we got to close the end of the book. I wonder what this book is really all about. And she said, Miss J, everyone is beautiful, even if you don't have things.
mm,
So 6 years old, kindergartner.
my
And
gosh.
it's like, you know, our babies that
Yes.
so many
Yes.
people, our Black and brown babies in the Bronx,
Mm-hmm.
on, you know, on the north side of
Mm-hmm.
San Jose, wherever it is that we is, there are so many people who are looking at these children, our children, through this deficit lens when there's so much abundance there. When a 6-year-old is able to identify and say that material possessions don't define who human beings are, every
Mm-mm.
human being has value. Why
Yes.
can't an adult teacher see that?
Right.
Right. And that's what we're trying to encourage teachers to do, right? Look
Yeah.
at children through this lens of abundance and realize
Right.
that everything, what's CJ's Nana? Is that what he calls his grandma, Nana?
Yes.
You
Anna.
know, she's like,
Mm-hmm.
"Child, look at this rainbow, look at the, you know."
Yes.
And
Yes.
so that's
And I'm
not
also,
to ignore the very real inequities. You know, we don't do that, but we
yeah.
also want to find the beauty in our circumstances.
Yes, it's inhumane to have our Black and brown children only believing that a neighborhood and a community is beautiful if it looks like the suburbs. Think about the inhumanity of that. And so, how do we as teachers counter that? How do we, forget about countering that? How do we make sure the narrative is, no, your community is beautiful? And while we're shouting out books, I have to, and since we talked about the Bronx, I have to shout out I Can Write the World by Joshunda Sanders, which is about the Bronx, New York. And it's literally about what we're talking about. The main character is noticing how outsiders are portraying her neighborhood. And her mom is teaching her about the history of the Bronx and hip hop and salsa and music and, art that have come out of the community, despite the ways that the society has worked to oppress the people in that community. So that brings me to our fifth point and our fifth question that we want educators to think about, and we can continue to shout out books, right? But what are educators' guiding principles for text selection, right? And we just modeled that, right, without even realizing that we were going to do that. But really, what is your, we want educators to be thinking about what are your guiding principles for choosing texts? And how are you making this transparent to the community, to other teachers, to families, to students. In a nutshell, in short, why this book? Any book that you're picking up, why this book? Ariel, we know when we pick up Last Stop on Market Street, we know why this book. When I pick up I Can Write the World, I know why this book. Let's talk about, the why in choosing books and how important that is for educators to be thinking about.
Yeah, I just started editing the children's literature um, section of language arts for NCTE. And so
Mm,
I've actually been thinking about this question a lot because of course, there's a theme to the issue, but also I'm thinking about like, what are the lenses? And so, typically that column has been just a list of books, right? A tiny introduction and then just a list of books with book reviews. And I thought, how can I change this in a way that helps teachers to be able to replicate what I'm attempting to do in terms of choosing books that are anti-racist, that are affirming to children, and those sorts of things. And so I've actually been trying to use a lot of different lenses. So for the first column I wrote, I used Dr. Kendi's Anti-Racist Baby as the lens through which we select text. And so I looked at each and every one of those tenets, those 9 tenets that he lists, and I
mhm,
thought, okay, what books effectively teach this to children? So, for example, the idea about children needing vocabulary to talk about race. So I put unspeakable because that's an opportunity to teach children about whitewash, right? So that's just one lens, that I use, is looking at all of those tenets and saying, like, if this book teaches this particular concept, this tenet of anti-racism, as Dr. Kendi has written it in Anti-Racist Baby, so it's accessible language, then it's going to be, it's a good choice, right, for teachers to make. The most recent column that I wrote, I used Dr. Goldie Muhammad's framework for selecting text. And so, is this text going to nurture joy?
mhm,
Is
mhm.
this text going to both respect and nurture the intellect of my students? Is, like going through each and every one of her tenets and selecting texts in that way. So I think like having solid frameworks and lenses through which to view text is really important. With Dr. Kim Parker, she originally developed some questions, and then we've been doing a lot of work together. And so we've done a lot of revision over the last couple of years, but we're thinking through a set of questions that helps us decide alongside teachers, like, is this a text? And so I won't say all the questions, but a few of them are like, is this text written by an Own Voices author? And we're not going to get into the Own Voices conversation today. It's too much. But that idea of authenticity,
Yeah.
right? And one of my favorites that we ask is, like, does the text promote celebration of or healing from the past? Does it speak truth to the present? Does it convey hope for the future through children's agency and self-directed action?
Yeah.
Right? So we're not doing this like saviorism thing. Like, is this text going to help children seize control and power over their own lives
Yeah.
through the understanding of history and what people who look like them have done? Is
Yeah.
it a counter narrative to stereotypes? Does it convey love? We don't talk enough,
Mhm,
like Dr. Carla Shalaby talks about, like, we don't talk enough about love in
mm,
schools, and not that, oh, I love you feeling thing, but like real critical
yeah.
love. So yeah, those are just a few of the questions that we think through. Another one of my favorites is, does the text provide a portal to students' radical imagination? Like, are we
Mhm.
helping to nurture, instead of taking that away at school, are we helping to nurture children's radical imagination? Because I'm telling you, one thing that I 100% believe is that the children are going to set us free. They're
Yeah.
going to lead us out of this because they have the imagination to both believe in and create a world that doesn't currently exist.
Yeah. Yeah, that is such important work that you are doing, and our good friend Dr. Kim Parker is doing. And I've been thinking a lot about the duality of teachers needing, these sets of guiding questions that you were just sharing, in order to think about why this book, with the need for educators to teach students to think about, why am I picking this book? Because I think that has to be explicitly taught to students, to choose books that will not harm them. I've been doing a lot of thinking and writing lately about, who writes a text mattering. And like you said, we're not going to get into the whole own voices movement, but it matters. And I need students to know that. And so I've also been thinking about Dr. Muhammad's framework as a framework to help students choose books, to help them engage in collective inquiry, to lean into each other's genius, to read with identity and criticality and joy. Beginning with, as a look at a book, to think about, who are the creators of this text?
Mhm.
What are their backgrounds and motivations for writing it? And how do their identities influence this work? And without sufficient answers to these kinds of questions, students need to know, maybe I want to put that book down because I might be harmed, just based on, who's writing this text. And as they read the text, thinking about how it reflects and affirms their identities and lived experiences. How does it help raise awareness, as we've been talking about? How does this text make a difference to their heart, in their lives? How are they being challenged or changed by this book? And what about their own identities or the identities of others do they need to know more about as they start to read that book? As being some important questions for students to be thinking about, as they decide, why this book? Out of all these books, why do I want to read this one?
Yeah. As you talk about that, I want to shout out Jess Lifshitz.
Yes.
She does beautiful work with children around text selection and reading text with criticality. And I think that everyone should read her blog, Crawling Out of the Classroom. I think it's just crawling out of the classroom.blogspot.com, but you
Yeah.
can certainly just Google Crawling Out of the Classroom and find the gorgeous work that she has done with students around this if you're looking for,
Yeah.
a powerful example.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, Ariel, we've got a lot to think about. I think, the road ahead will be bumpy, but it's important for everyone to know, when hasn't it been? Right? When hasn't the road been bumpy? There has never been a normal that any of us should have been satisfied with in the entire field of education. Really, truly, if we are courageous enough to admit that. So it will be bumpy, but educators are the most incredible humans on the planet. I believe in teachers. I believe in our students. And I know that, with our commitment to equitable practices, we can move forward.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to point out to educators that if we don't do this work, what we are doing is enacting violence. And so, I don't think that gets said enough and clearly enough for people to really understand. I was in a group with some educators the other day, and the teacher said, oh, she was a little nervous about counteracting. She's in Texas, where CRT has come up in legislation and it's been passed. And she, how do I keep my job and continue to do this work with children? You can't ask the how do I keep my job question, right? You have to understand that you are enacting violence against children if you don't do the work, and there are jobs everywhere, quite frankly. And so we have to stand up, stand in our power. We have power that we're not tapping into. So
Yeah.
thank you, Sonia.
Thanks, Ariel.